Hi folks, we're back and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. This system in which we live has always been dominated by a dominant elite, sometimes called a dominant minority in academia. And people like Aldous Huxley talked about that. He called them the dominant minority. He said at Berkeley when he gave a talk there that there'd always been a dominant minority running the people, and he didn't see any reason why it wouldn't continue off into the future. In other words, democracy and so on, it wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't discussed at all. It was kind of an irrelevant thing. And technically it is an irrelevant thing because what you're given as democracy is a sham. It's nothing but a sham to keep you working away and happy and giving yourself. You give your power to the people who you think are governing you. You give them legal power over you to do as they will. And if you haven't learned your lessons by now, then I guess you never will. The older you get, regardless of the type of government they claim they are, they're all the same, exactly the same, because there's only one agenda. And they know where they're going with it. But eugenics and economics have always been tied up completely together. You can't separate one from the other because everything to do in this system, we're told, is to do with economics. And the bad news is always tax rises all the time to do with new programs or military spending or whatever it happens to be, or welfare. And this is basically tied in with the whole idea of investing and eugenics, because anyone investing in any area or country or group of countries must know how the population behaves. How are they? Are they good workers? Are they fit? Are they healthy? Are they sickly? Etc., etc. And that's always been the way of it. When you go back into the old writings of John Stuart Mill and then his son of the same name, they had that wrapped in with their theories and their predictions, completely intertwined together, the fitness of a people. And in other words, how well can they produce on my behalf if I'm going to invest money there? Because the whole profit motive is behind investment. It's not to do with giving anybody work, believe you me. And also to do with the mentality of the people. Every nation's and the character of every people has been well documented and recorded on behalf of economics, and the economists are really into this kind of stuff. So are the militaries too of all countries. They want to know the personality types, the prevailing culture and mentality of a people. Will they run away from a battle? Are they persistent in battle even when they lose the first few, etc.? Do they win and then give up on the first time they lose? All of that stuff has been so well documented. It's rather incredible, really. Only incredible when you realize you don't exist to serve yourself or those around you. You exist to serve the economy. And that's taught as fact today. And that's why when they come out in the newspapers and even talking about the cost of keeping a welfare state or the cost of keeping a national health service, it's basically taking away from the profit motive. And it doesn't look so healthy when other peoples want to invest in your area or country, if you think you've got a country that is left. So it's you just can't separate the two. And then we find people like Malthus, who was basically an economist, who worked for the British government and for the various companies and corporations of his day, the British East India Company. He also went across to the Dutch East India Company, and he basically was a European advisor to all these big corporations of the past that blossomed into other things, even empires. And he, of course, worked out even the calorific intake for food for the public or those who are working on their plantations, just enough to keep them working, producing on an efficient level, but not too healthy that they could run away at the end of the evening or when they were given their 4 or 5 hours sleep before they got up to work the next day. It was that perfected to do with diet. Has never changed, really. So, as I say, Darwin came along, of course. Darwin mixed with Marxism, and the two of them went flying off into creating this whole Marxist theory of evolution and the evolution of man himself into something great and a Superman to come, the Oberman. All that stuff came from the two theories combining. Personally, I think they were both fronting for something else. There's a trace of something else behind them both and pre-existing them down through history to the present time. But we had the communist era where they were trying to create the Soviet man, and then by the Nazi era where they were trying to create the Superman of Germany, of the Aryan type. But both of these things, really the ideas were born in London, England. In the city, really, of London, as they call it, the city, which is a sovereign entity unto itself, with its own laws and rules, and especially financial rules, for the banks are based there. The main banks are based there. And it's interesting too that even employment and unemployment is mixed in with economics, because you'd think that most folk do, in their simplicity, do think that governments are there to not impede the progress of job creation. Governments don't create jobs except for those who are employed by government, and believe you me, there's lots of them these days. But otherwise, government is a drain on everything. They're a consumer of taxation. And private companies, of course, are the only ones that can possibly create any kind of lasting, worthwhile jobs, especially if they're in production, actual production of something. But if everyone was fully employed, they claim in economics that the cost of labor would increase because employers would have to bribe folk to leave their existing jobs and come to them. So they always say they've got to have a good pool of unemployed people. That's standard economics in all government theories. So they make sure you've got a welfare state of some kind and a good pool of people you can pull from to keep wages low, because then it's an employer's market, as they say. They can offer you whatever they want to. Most folk live through their lives never really thinking about these things because it's not pushed except in academia, and the students who are going into those particular areas who end up working as economists in the area of controlling the rest of the public down below them. So their big dream, of course, was to create a society where everyone would simply obey and be fairly healthy, but obey. They didn't want everyone to have equal intellect, believe you me, through eugenics, for instance. They did not want that. They didn't want competition. A world where all the rest of those kinds down below them, the inferior types could match them in the future, was something of a horror to contemplate by those who already held onto the reins of power. Plus, they understood through big think tanks and world meetings they had prior to the 1930s, they'll need a base of people who could toil and work in factories and could toil in the soil, etc., without getting bored stiff and walking off. You need people with determination who can stick at it and endure hardship and rotten climates and rotten weather and all the rest of it, and keep the food growing and production going. And they themselves had said that the higher the intellect, that the harder it is to stay on at a boring job. So they knew that. That's why we find that Aldous Huxley and Brave New World had a different created type, in vitro fertilization type of alpha pluses and then alphas and all the way down to the lowly classes that simply were bred not to have too much of a mind that would wander. They would be quite happy doing repetitive jobs. That's always been the ideal of the Great Society, as they call it. There are many terms for the same thing, and the utopic vision, like the modern utopia, the book written by H.G. Wells, where and then inferior types eventually are eliminated off. They're just simply eliminated out of the picture through sterilization of one kind or another, and then, of course, they have their beautiful utopia where everyone knows what they're supposed to do, work at, and no one tries to better themselves into a higher class, a rigid system. At the moment, we're going through the sterilization process of covert sterilization that's not even investigated. Apparently, it's not even worthwhile to find out why. Since 1950, the sperm count has fallen by about 85% in the Western males. Nothing happens. If we've been here millions of years, as they claim, nothing happens by itself suddenly, and surely medicine itself looks at diseases in the course of them like any detective story. What has changed in the last 50 years, 60 years or so? What has changed? And then you can find out the causes. We know that inoculations came in big time then, and we also know that the food and the processing, etc., started to change too. And the food now it hardly resembles the food of the pre-50s at all, even by taste, never mind texture and so on. But the geneticists never ever stop. There's a good documentary to see, and I'll preface this particular documentary by mentioning that the Philosophical Society, which is a Freemasonic society, put it out. And it goes through the Soviet system, it goes through the English system, it goes through the eugenics societies in America that preceded all of them, in fact, through the Rockefeller Foundation and Cold Spring Harbor, where they had their big testing, their big headquarters for eugenics, and they sterilized so many people in different states of the U.S. It's just incredible. Went on into the 70s, from the 1920s. But this particular documentary, as I say, was put up by a Freemasonic society, and there's no condemnation of it, by the way, when you hear it mentioned. Very good documentary footage on it. But there's no condemnation, because in Freemasonry, even for those who don't know at the bottom level, and they really don't know much at all at the bottom level, they're the outer portico that Albert Pike talked about. They don't know much at all. But the upper levels, they know that that's part of their particular theory as well. The man's evolving, and those that get into the high degrees are superior than those who can't make it into them. It's actually a eugenic society, whether they've caught on to that or not. But the ones at the top certainly do know it's a eugenic society. They talk about inferior and superior types. But, and of course they think it's an innate thing in mankind himself to try and get to a higher level of understanding. So the documentary is called Architecture of Doom, and I'll put a link up for that tonight after I'm finished. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix after World War II, of course, with the racial hygiene programs, as it was called in Germany. Eugenics got a bad name, so they had to alter themselves into something else, of course. Really transformed themselves into another entity under more science, and they call themselves bioethicists now. Of course, bioethicists, what's correct and what is not correct. Should we kill these folk? Should we not kill these folk? And they toss the coins back and forth. Bioethics is a big thing today, and it's taught in all the big universities. But it's basically, it's the same as eugenics, plain and simple. And they never give up, of course, on this wonderful utopia, because they're funded by the biggest foundations on the planet. And if you remember too that Russia, Soviet Russia, was socialist, and that Germany was socialist, even though they call it fascism, it's the same darn thing as far as I'm concerned. They both had the same programs on the go. They both believed in the evolution of man. They also believed, especially in Russia, that the Lamarckian theory of evolution was a major step where you could condition people to pass on traits. You could actually condition them to pass on traits to their offspring. And then, of course, the Mendelian theory took over, and that's prevalent today. In other words, you are simply a product of your genetic makeup, and that's all you can ever be. That's what the one that won out today. And there's many fronts for eugenic societies, and the Human Genome Project was an amazing front that was well funded again. You have the CFR involved, you have the Council on Foreign Relations, Royal Institute for International Affairs, European Institute for International Affairs, the same bunch, they're all the same bunch. I hope you realize that too, the big bankers at the top. And you also have the foundations, the Rockefeller foundations and Ford, Carnegie, etc., a whole host of foundations to do with eugenics, basically. Pushing a socialist world to give governments more control and ultimately the right to decide who can breed and who will not breed. That's the purpose of it at the moment. And they use lovely cons. Now, one of the eugenicists is a man who heads up the Human Genome Project. He's the boss, and he's come out with a new test, supposedly. And here's how it's worded. This is a handout to all newspapers, a complete handout from the guys who are pushing this. It says, new genetic test for severe childhood diseases. So it sounds legit. Or it's a test for severe. It doesn't say that might find or possibly might or anything like that. No. Then it says couples are to be offered a simple test to stop them passing on any of more than 500 genetic diseases to their children, right? So that sounds very concrete in its wording. And it says the blood test that costs £400 per person could be available in months and eliminate hereditary illnesses such as cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia. So it says it could be available. That could only applies to beat the availability of it. But it says, and eliminate hereditary illnesses. So it's going to eliminate, they claim, right? It says, but it's also controversial because critics claim it could lead to a new form of eugenics. It's the same form of eugenics with the usual priesthood, white coats behind it. It says parents with a risk could ask for embryos to be screened out through IVF treatment or abortion if they were at risk of passing on a serious disease. Now, I've read on the air here articles in the past where people were advised to have abortions because of possibilities of things. Then they found that their children were perfectly healthy when they went ahead and didn't abort. Makes you wonder how many other ones would be healthy too. Because these screening tests are pretty well rubbishy. They cannot tell if you're going to have that disease or not. They cannot tell that. But you wouldn't think so if you read this. It's really an handout, an advertisement. It's handed out to all the newspapers. They put it right in their papers, quite happy to have some filler space. And of course there's no inquiry into it, or the guy who heads it up in his past and his history too. You can look up at Wikipedia for yourself, the Human Genome Project, and this article, and you'll find out who that is. Anyway, so a preconception genetic test could be used routinely by doctors to screen for severe recessively inherited childhood diseases in couples before they have children, reports a new study. Those with a family history of conditions such as cystic fibrosis and Fragile X syndrome, that's when you end up in these strange movies called the X movies, are already entitled to screening on the National Health Service, it says. But they're not, they're definitely not very reliable at all. Already tests are available for 100 or so diseases in the private sector, but now with more powerful gene screening equipment, scientists have extended the range. So it's developed by the National Center for Genome Resources in New Mexico, and yada, 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 etc. It sounds all so wonderful for safety who wants somebody who doesn't measure up to what's supposed to be the norm. And why not just abort it or allow them, if you've got extra cash, to take those genes out and replace them with proper genes, the proper type, you see. And that's really what eugenics is all about. It's the same thing with the poor, etc. It's not that they want to bring down the whole human race. They want to bring down the wrong kind of people. That's what they've said in the past. That's what Charles Galton Darwin said himself in the 1950s. The wrong kind. The wrong kind will outbreed the better kind, you see. The ones who are more psychopathic and know how to fight to get up there into positions of power and wealth by ripping everybody else off. Because that's all Darwinism is. Survival of the fittest is the most cunning and utterly ruthless with less conscience. If you've got a conscience, you can't get up there. Can't do it. So I'll put this article up tonight. As I say, all these articles up at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and you can look it up for yourself. Now, here's another article in today as well, journalnow.com. It says victims of forced sterilization are hurting and dying off. This is in the United States, the forced sterilization program of eugenics of the past. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back and this is Cutting Through the Matrix and talking about eugenics just to kick the show off really because it's in the news and how they're going ahead with it under again the better science. They're better now at eugenics than they used to be, and that they hate the term eugenics. They want to help civilization and help society by basically having the right to tamper with your genes and your sperm and the ovum and all the rest of it and decide who should live and die. Basically, that's always been their program. And yet, as I say, here's an article here. It says victims of forced sterilization are hurting and dying off because they had this forced sterilization, not just in the US, I had it in Canada too, especially for American Indians. but it says victims of sterilization are hurting and dying off. And at the state legislature, as it convenes on Wednesday, Governor Bev Perdue should present it with a clear plan for helping the surviving victims of North Carolina's forced sterilization program. Some might argue that with the legislature facing the challenge of closing a $3.7 billion budget shortfall, this is not the time to help those victims. I think economics again, isn't it? But with the victims continuing to suffer with physical and emotional ills from their operations, and with some of them having died waiting for help, the state has a moral obligation to finally right the wrong it visited upon them. Well, they see there's no moral right when it comes to economics. It's a very bland, straight, up and down affair. Anyway, this article here goes on about some of the history of the eugenics movement and the compulsory sterilization. Because they had programs for the perfect American family funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, from the very beginning. And they helped to get that through most of the U.S. states. They ran from the 20s, as I say, right through into the 70s. And they want to go back to it again. So I'll put that up as well. Now here's another article that ties right in with it too. This is a repetition of studies that do all the time to make sure that people are kept pretty dumb at the bottom, because they're kept dumb even by the junk food that they eat. It says junk food diet may lower the children's IQ, studies suggest. Well, they've done this for as long as I've been alive. They know darn well what it does to the public. They know darn well what kind of diet a child needs when it's growing. And what happens to its brain if it doesn't get the proper diet. So another study just to make sure they're on target with keeping enough of the population at the bottom, pretty low on the totem pole of the IQ they climb.
Yes. I had some other questions about free health care for Native Canadians. I myself fall under that category, and I heard also, I've been listening to your stuff about inoculations and stuff, and I myself have had ear troubles as a child. I still do, I just and I heard you mention intuition as well with other people, and I sort of felt this sort of intuition, this sort of distrust of a lot of stuff growing up as a Native Canadian, and just seeing, just certain things on a smaller scale in sort of like a schoolyard setting or, certain settings, and just sort of feeling this sort of intuition or distrust of certain things, feeling there's something bigger going on here.
Oh, there's something bigger going on. We're getting trained exactly to know exactly what we're supposed to know. And whether it's true or false doesn't matter. We're supposed to know this. But your inoculations, you understand too, that especially Indians on reservations in Canada, because they get grants and so on, and they're kept in these reservations, by law they have to accept the medical authorities. They have to accept them. And so it's really, they have field testing there on all these different inoculations. Now, what's interesting to me is that childhood diseases, the runny noses, the otitis media, all the ear problems and so on, they tell you is natural in medical school. But before they came out with all these young, the infant inoculations, it didn't happen. They didn't have these. In other words, these things they were getting as childhood problems were actually caused by the vaccines. And I personally know people whose daughters, that their daughters have had children, and they convinced them, different ones convinced them for the next child not to have inoculations. The ones who had no inoculations had no childhood diseases, no sore ears, no runny noses, no coughs. So obviously it's caused by the very stuff that they're injecting into you. But the Indians, unfortunately, are supposed to mandatorily take all these inoculations because they take grants. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I've been wondering about that. What, why do the Native people get, seem to be, get all this free health care and free, tax breaks and all this stuff like that. And there's treaties have been broken and all this stuff, but it seems like they're still sort of getting a little bit of an edge on other people. And I just wondered, why is that? Why these people? You know what I mean? It must be something going on there.
If you go into, this is a fascinating thing. If you go into the history of eugenics and economics, and go into the writings of John Stuart Mill, he has it listed as long as the same as H.G. Wells had it listed. He worked for the later organization of the same group. They had all the different peoples listed as the superior all the way down to inferior. And they all had it classified, even in the 1700s, that the American Indian, the Irish, and eventually H.G. Wells added it later on to the Scots as well, would be people who would have to be eliminated because they couldn't adapt into the new system. That's no kidding, that's what they said. So hold on, we're back with more after this break. Hi folks, we're back and cutting through the matrix. I don't know if Justin's still there. Is he still there, Justin?
Yes, I'm still here, Alan.
I was going to say that, you understand that the whole policy, the whole belief system or religion of eugenics and Darwinism states that if people cannot adapt, not only do they die, they must die. Or they'll bring down those who are evolving higher and higher. They'll bring them down. That's what they truly believe, and that's really official policy through academia. They still push and promote the same thing. That's through government as well. And I've talked to, I knew someone who was up in the government, the Federal Department for Indian Affairs in Canada. And she told me that she criticized that the Indians wouldn't work and so on, and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, see, the only way you can adapt into this system, it is a system, is by joining them and mimicking them, as Charles Darwin called it too. Those who can't mimic the white guy, it has to perish, basically. And that means also going into the same kind of business, money lending or money borrowing, etc., and producing. That's what they call the normal system. And so they will not tolerate any other kind of system going alongside themselves. So I think it's personally it's policy of simple extermination over time. That's all it is to me. Yeah.